Okay, with that, if you have a Bible, would you open it to John's Gospel, chapter 11. And when you get to John chapter 11, would you do me a favor and stand to your feet as we prepare to read God's word together? And I'll invite our reader this morning to come up. And I'll forewarn you, this is a longer passage, which is why I asked your favorite reader to come and read to you today.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary, and her sister Martha. It was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. When Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after this he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 hours away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Mary and Martha to comfort them concerning their brother. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Jesus was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And when she had said these things, she went away and secretly called Mary her sister, saying, The teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha had met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, She is going to the tomb to weep there. Then, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him. Then some of them said, Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he is being dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Loose him and let him go.
Thank you. You can grab a seat. I was recently having a conversation with my kids about their favorite kids' movies. And you could probably guess some of the ones that landed on their top 10 list, but you might not, however, successfully guess the strange direction that the conversation went in. We started discussing the common thread that was running through so many of these films that they were talking about. And this common thread really doesn't feel very kid appropriate at all. And this is not me winding up for an anti-Disney rant, so don't get too excited. But think about how many kids, because this is what my kids brought up, think about how many kids' movies involve parents who have died or who are outside of the picture. I mean, the Toy Story series introduces a single mom. In Frozen, it begins with Anna and Elsa's parents drowning. Nemo's mom was eaten at the commencement of that film. Cinderella, Snow White, and Sleeping Beauty are all without parents. Tarzan was raised by gorillas. Aladdin was raised on the streets. Matilda is raised in a broken foster system. And Annie was raised in an orphanage. My daughter Riley, as she starts talking through all of these, all of a sudden she pipes up again and says, I can only think of one Disney princess who has both parents, and that's Rapunzel, and she was kidnapped from them. And one of my kids quickly added to the conversation, yeah, but none of these are as bad as Bambi. And I'll tell you, I hadn't seen Bambi in a long time, so I turned to Professor Google to kind of fill me in and catch me up to remind me, and my kids weren't wrong. It's not just that the story of Bambi follows this mama who dies, it's that Bambi watches his own mother be shot and killed right in front of it. The story's theme, though, is not so much then the motherless, cute fawn named Bambi. Really, the story's theme of the whole story is death itself. You know, while in the Second World War, the film was released in the summer of 1942, and it would drag the reality of death onto the cinematic screen to depict and discuss what all of humanity was already grappling with amidst the Second World War. The story was actually originally a book, though, that was written during the end of the First World War, and it was both widely popular in Eastern Europe and it was banned and burned in Nazi Germany, where it was regarded as a parable about the treatment of Jews in Europe. In the story, the vulnerable animals view man as godlike, seemingly holding the power of death and life over them as their ultimate predator. But the movie ends after displaying that both man and nature itself, with this blazing forest fire, are out to destroy the helpless animals, leaving survival to be a constant struggle for all. However, not in the movie, but in the novel that the movie's based on, it wraps up when the father of Bambi shows her a man's body dead in the woods. And then the book concludes with this statement from the father to the young fawn saying, do you see Bambi? How he's lying there dead like one of us? The old stag asked. Listen, Bambi, he isn't all powerful as they say. Everything that lives and grows doesn't come from him. He isn't above us. He's just the same as we are. He has the same fears, the same needs, and suffers in the same way. He can be killed like us, and then he lies helpless on the ground like the rest of us, as you see him now. Then the father asks, do you understand this? And Bambi replies, I think so. There is another who is over us all, over us and over him. I mean, do you understand when it comes to death, both man and beast are found to be its prey, with no exceptions. And that's the point of the story told amidst the horrors of World War II. As one author would put it, though, death is real and no creature can prevail over it, but death does have a master. There is another who reigns over all, even over death. And that's what Jesus claimed in our little passage that we had read to us this morning. It's actually what his statement was about him having power over life and death when Jesus said in John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. My friends, we all know that it's not a question of one day if we will die. It's really a question just of when it will happen. We know that it's true, and yet death always seems to stun us and to sucker punch us when it arrives and when it forces us to face its reality. And a part of the reason that it shocks and stuns us is because we live trying to avoid and hide ourselves from it. Death truly is humanity's elephant in the room, you could say. But I believe the other reason that it shocks and stuns us is because something inside us, every time we're faced with death, something inside us tells us that it just shouldn't be this way, that it just isn't right. And the Bible tells you it's because you were not created to die. That this is unnatural for us, that sin entered creation and death came with it. And the story that we find today involves some of Jesus' closest friends having not just to grapple with the possibility of death, they're having to endure the depth of sorrow that only the reality of death can bring our way. Now, as many as you already know, we're wrapping up our series looking at the 7 I am statements of Jesus, a series that we have called Jesus in his own words, where we've looked at these autobiographical statements of Jesus that he used to give an introduction to himself, telling us who he was and what he came to do in order to remove all controversy or doubt or argument about who he was and what he came to do. Jesus said these 7 things. And what we do to conclude this series is today we hit rewind a little bit to go back to the middle of these statements so that we can give a bit more attention to the one we used it as an introduction. You might remember we started this series on Easter Sunday at Old Poway Park, and I just tagged this statement really onto the end of an Easter message. And so what I want to do today is slow down and look at it together a bit more closely. Before I do that, I do want to just mention this. I've met some people who have joined us here since that gathering at Old Poway Park. And if that's you, I just want to thank you that you have continued to join us to get to know more about this Jesus, whether here in person or online. Thank you for jumping in with us in this series. So today we revisit this statement, though, from John 11:25, where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. And what I want you to do with me this morning is to observe with me what stands out in this story and moment where Jesus makes this statement. And I want to discuss with you, first in the story, why Jesus delayed, and then secondly, what Jesus does in this moment, but then what Jesus also promises to continue to do. That's the third thing. Why he delayed, what he does, and what he continues to do. With the other of these 7 statements that Jesus makes, these 7 I am statements that he's made, we've spent more time looking just at the statement itself and leaving many of the surrounding details just to be briefly touched on. But this statement, I really want to slow down and look at the context in the story around Jesus' statement, because unfortunately all of us will find our lives take us into very similar heartbreaking circumstances when we can no longer hide ourselves from the looming reality of death. And so I want to look at the story together with you, because across every culture, background, and era of world history, death is undeniable, it's unavoidable, and it's an inevitable experience that we all share in common. No one has ever or will ever be exempt from death. You might feel uncomfortable with the process of dying, and that's okay. I'm not so comfortable with the process of dying either, because I don't know what it'll look like for me one day. However, you no longer need to fear the inescapable reality of death, because Jesus proved that he holds the power of life and death, and he promised that our future fate is secure in him. So jump into the story with me by observing first why Jesus delayed. That's the first thing I want you to see. Why Jesus delayed, because there's this really bizarre development in our story that you may have already noticed, and that's that when Jesus hears about his friends calling for his help, because their brother, whom it's very clear in our story, is someone that Jesus loved and cared for and counted as a friend, their brother is very sick. And Jesus' response to their request is not to hustle off on the day-long journey to go and see Lazarus, nor does he just say a word from where he stood in order to instantly heal Lazarus, as he had done in other circumstances. Instead, we're simply told that Jesus waited. Now, I'll just tell you, it's true not just of Jesus in this story, but it feels true and even quite commonplace in my own life that God's priorities and his timeline don't often align with my own. My priority and goal is often, my top priority is to mitigate pain in my life. And I don't always feel confident that my comfort is Jesus' top priority too. Even in this story, relief from pain and removal of emotional turmoil seem to take a back seat to God in this moment being glorified, and in doing so, the faith of men and women becoming solidified because of that glory that they see. You see, that I believe is God's great goal. For you to see him as he is, as great and glorious, worthy of your trust, and for you then to choose faith and to trust in him. The scriptures say it this way, that without faith, it's impossible to please him, which you and I should feel as a massive, like cosmic relief. Because scriptures don't say, without perfect obedience, it's impossible to please him. Or without selling all and living in poverty, it's impossible to please him. Or without dying a martyr's death, you'll never, ever please him. No, it says without faith, it's impossible to please him. God's great goal and desire for us is that what we would do is that we would embrace faith and trust in him. And he is willing to go to great lengths to prove that he is faithful and trustworthy. And those great lengths are not just allowing me or you to struggle and suffer. No, that would be cruel if that's all that God would do in order to generate and build faith in us. He himself will instead suffer and die on a cross as the ultimate demonstration and proof of his commitment to you. And then he'll rise again to demonstrate his power over the grave and the reality of his true identity. Remember, please, we're discussing why Jesus delayed. Because the story begins with what we could classify as just a simple prayer. Where in verse 3, it says that they sent word to Jesus saying, "Lord, our brother whom you love is sick." And for years at this point, we've seen Jesus healing the sick in his lifetime. People who were crippled and blind, people with ailments and illnesses of all kinds came to him and were touched by him and healed by him. Or even just with the spoken word from afar, he'd say the word and the person in that instant would be healed and made whole. Without a doubt, it would be easy for Jesus to come and to do this, especially for a friend. But it's just not in the story what you find Jesus doing. And adding to our confusion is the fact that the Bible's account of the story affirms Jesus' real love for him, for this sick man. And then it tells you that he delays, though, in going to him. In other words, they appeal to the love of Jesus for him as the motivation for why Jesus should come to him. But the decision of Jesus to delay is described for us as being because he loved him. Because he loved him, he delayed. In fact, look in your Bible again at verse 4, where it tells you that when Jesus heard that, he said, "The sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Jesus delayed to go to them, it says, because he loved them. He loved them, so he stayed and waited. Please hear me. Jesus' delays are often enough of a reason we conclude for us to question his love. But for Jesus to delay in this moment was precisely, it says, because of his love. You see, my tendency is to judge God based upon my circumstances. It's something you see the disciples do when they're in the midst of a storm and overwhelmed. Remember, they wake Jesus up, and their prayer, it sounded like this: "Jesus, don't you care that we're perishing here?" But please hear me. Jesus' delays are often enough of a reason we conclude for us to question his love. But for Jesus to delay in this moment, he said, was precisely because of his love. Remember, the story just began with their simple prayer where they said, "Let's send word to Jesus that the one that you love, he's sick." Well, and my tendency is that I question his love when he delays in moments like this. But it tells me here that he delayed because of his love for them. By delaying, he's allowing them to see who he truly is and allowing them to see God's power at work. Remember, we're talking about why he'd do this. Why would he delay? Jesus' initial comments in verse 4, it almost leave you a bit confused, don't they? Or at least it makes you actually wonder, was Jesus confused? Where he says to his disciples, "The sickness, it's not unto death." Or in verse 11 where he says, "Our friend Lazarus, he sleeps, but I will go and wake him up." And the disciples, they're encouraged by Jesus' comments. And they comment that surely he must be improving then if all he's doing is being able to rest. Surely rest will do him well. And then Jesus in verse 14, he clears up their confusion when he says plainly, "No, Lazarus, he's dead." You see, Jesus was clearly using a figure of speech before that, a metaphor for death, and saying that Lazarus was only sleeping, one that we still even use to this day, where we talk about rest in peace, or that they went and were laid to rest. Jesus is picking up on a social or a cultural metaphor and using it here, but then he makes clear, to make sure that no one's confused about where he stands on this, he knows that Lazarus is dead, and he will find him soon in a grave. Jesus will then pronounce that it's time to start the day-long road trip to the village of Bethany to see Mary and Martha and the one that they had laid inside the tomb, their beloved brother. Now think about this with me. There's some simple math that you could employ that would make it clear that if it's a day's journey for the messenger to bring word to Jesus of Lazarus being sick, and if Jesus then waited 2 additional days before starting the day-long journey out to see them, then you could conclude that by the time word reached Jesus of his illness, that Lazarus was already dead. I say that because it tells you in verse 39 that Lazarus has been in the grave, he's been in the tomb, dead for 4 days. So shortly after, this unnamed servant or messenger leaves that family to take word to Jesus, trying to convince him to come and heal Lazarus. Before he even reaches Jesus to carry their request, Lazarus has already died. And because of a lack of refrigeration in antiquity, a body would have been immediately dressed for burial and placed inside a tomb because of the rapid nature of decay and to protect the community from the potential spread of disease. And there weren't a bunch of companies you'd call in to do that. You should be picturing Martha and Mary, having sent the messenger off in hopes of Jesus coming in time, now sitting down with their brother to dress his wounds or to anoint his body. The one who had been sick, who is now dead, is being cleaned up and prepared for a grave by his own family. You know, one of the ways that we learn about the prevailing line of thinking in Jewish culture in the time of Christ is we look at these ancient rabbinic writings that were compiled a generation or so after Jesus, called the Mishnah and the Talmud. And these ancient writings, they're preserved for us today, and they record a lot of Jewish folklore, giving you a hint and a clue, a look into the way that the Jewish people in the first century thought about all sorts of different matters. And some of it is purely superstition, but it is interesting to get a view kind of beneath the dome of the first century mind. And in those writings, it tells us that the dead body was not believed to be truly and finally dead until the 4th day. In the Talmud, it says it this way: the whole strength of the morning is not till the 3rd day. For 3 days long, the soul returns to the grave, thinking that it will return into the body. When, however, it sees that the color of its face has changed, then it goes away and leaves it. Okay, in other words, the prevailing superstitious thought of the day was that the soul would hover around the body for 3 days after death, hoping for a way to re-enter. But once the body started to decompose and the corpse started to change its color, the soul would become aware of the fact that there's no going back, and the soul would depart once and for all. Now, if I had to take a guess, I'd assume that the reason that folklore existed is because someone at some point in time probably thought an individual had died, and that person was laid to rest for a couple of days, and then they heard some noise and realized the person was actually alive and had maybe gone into a coma or something and wasn't actually dead. But because of that, this was the thought, that you had about a 3-day window of kind of holding on to hope, but at the end of it, all of your mourning would come out. All of the tears would be shed because you'd finally know on that arrival of the 4th day that they were officially, completely, totally gone. And it may be one of the reasons why Jesus chose to delay in the way that he did, waiting to arrive until after that 3rd day. For Jesus to wait until Lazarus had been dead for 4 days is meant to communicate that everyone that was present knew that this situation was beyond all hope. He was dead and there was no coming back from that. So track with me. If Jesus had just, when he heard the news, had just healed Lazarus when he was simply sick, Jesus would have only provided a temporal solution for a relentless and inescapable problem. Lazarus would still face a future illness and eventually a future death. And if Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead only after 2 or 3 days, it could have allowed for confusion in that cultural moment regarding whether or not Lazarus had actually died or if he was really just merely revived or resuscitated instead of miraculously, inexplicably resurrected from the dead from the midst of a very hopeless, utterly hopeless situation. But it leads us to a second thing to consider, and that's what Jesus does. Don't just think about why Jesus delays here, because it is perplexing, but think then about what Jesus does after delaying. And what the text does is it stages 3 things for us that Jesus does as he confronts death and the grave. And I want you to know that these are 3 reactions I believe he still has towards death and the grave. The first is that Jesus snarls, and then you see that he weeps, and then you see Jesus was victorious when confronted with death in the grave. Think about this. First, he snarled when confronted with death in the grave. Maybe you're asking, well, where was Jesus angry in the text? That lady had a nice voice with a little accent. I don't remember any anger coming out. We actually found it in verse 33, where it says, therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. That same Greek word is used again in verse 38, where it says, then Jesus again, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, it says, and a stone laid against it. That word that's used in both those passages in describing what people were watching and observing in Jesus when he was confronted with death and the grave, that word for groaning means to snort in anger. It's used to describe an animal, specifically a horse, that would snarl or snort in angry disapproval. Now, why in the world is Jesus angry? Or who, maybe we should ask him, is he angry at? If Jesus would have been angry at Lazarus, or even at Mary or Martha, or even at the crowd who gathered to weep with him, his anger would have been misguided. It would have been misdirected. It would have been aimed at the wrong people and place. But his anger wasn't towards them at all. His anger was at death itself. His anger was at the cause of death, at human rebellion and sin. That's what was in his crosshairs. That's why he was angry. He was angry at what sin had cost mankind, what it had cost them when they rebelled against God. So you find him soon, even crushed on Gethsemane's floors, overwhelmed by sorrow at what it will cost him too. Oh no, he's angry in this moment, but not at them. He's angry at sin and Satan and destruction that it's brought amongst his good creation. My friends, if Jesus' anger was towards anyone who was present that day, his anger would have been misguided. And I think there's a challenging point of application here, and a question that you and we must answer. And that's, where is your anger pointed at? Or who is your anger pointed at? Is your anger misguided? Sure, we could ask, like we did of Jesus, are you angry at people that you shouldn't be? When it's really the result of the fall and sin and brokenness that we suffer, and that your heart is now left filled with sorrow because of those things. But if we're honest, we'd admit that it's easier to blame a person and to have an us versus them mentality than it is in humility to accept the things that we can neither control nor explain, even when we're left hurt, wanting to make ourselves into a victim and find a villain. But I also want to ask you, is your anger misdirected when you pin the source of your suffering and sorrow on God himself? Are you blaming him for things that maybe he's in no way responsible for? Is it time today to, in humility, to look to him in repentance, asking for forgiveness for your anger with him because of the suffering and the sorrow that you've been forced to endure? Maybe because you too, you've stood at the grave of a loved one and found that your tears also ran out. Only because they felt as though they ran out and you felt as though Jesus had failed to show up at all in that situation. That you, like them, you looked to fetch Jesus with a prayer, but the silence from heaven felt deafening as you waited for him to respond. Did you catch Martha's response here in verse 21 and 22? I'll just tell you, this really hit me personally this week. This really challenged me personally, and so I want you to look with me at what she says there. She says to Jesus, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. I so appreciate the way that she's freely expressing her disappointment with Jesus. And yet also, this is what she says in verse 22, but even now, I believe that you can do all things. Now, I want you to know, she is not expecting a resurrection here. She's just pronounced that Jesus missed his window to heal her brother. In fact, she argues with Jesus. Yes, surely my brother will rise again in the last day, on the final day at the resurrection of all. She's arguing with him that this is not possible for you to raise him from the dead. In fact, when Jesus even says, would you open the tomb? She's the one who stands up and says, it's a bad idea because it's going to be stinky. In fact, the old King James is beautiful. It says it so eloquently and poetically. It says, Lord, he stinketh. Don't open the tomb. She's the one who's standing in protest to Jesus. She is not expecting him to raise her brother from the dead. But please don't miss this. Her expressing, saying, but even now I believe that you can do all things. What she's saying is that although I'm wounded and deeply disappointed, which she had just told him she was, she's saying, I still believe you and I still trust you. Can you pray like that? With that kind of honesty and yet that kind of faith? I mean, have you been wounded like this, disappointed by Jesus, seeming to be inactive or uninvolved in your tragedy and heartbreak? I can't speak for you, but I can speak for myself in saying that my deepest wounds were caused by things that someone else has done, but the wound that's taken the longest to heal out of that moment was the healing that had to come to my own trust in Jesus, who I felt didn't show up and didn't answer in time. And it was devastating for me to see weeks and months and even years go by before I could see clearly just the way that my trust in him had truly been damaged and truly was impacted. As I struggled to pray, unable to say what Martha is here saying, yes, that if you would have done something, it wouldn't have happened, but also able to say, but even now, I still believe you can do all things. Are you struggling today to echo that prayer? Listen, in verse 40, Jesus says that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God. Don't misunderstand Jesus here. Believing was not a precondition to experiencing a miracle. He doesn't say, if you believe, I'll do it. He said that their faith would allow them to see the glory of God in the midst of a broken situation of suffering and loss and death and a grave. And the same is true for you and for me. Until we have faith to go back to Jesus and utter those words again, even now, I believe that you can do all things. Jesus, even now, I still trust you and your ability and your love. Until we utter those words again, we too will fail to see the glory of God while our hurt, our distrust, and our fears eclipse his gracious, loving faithfulness from our view. Don't just look at why he delays, but you need to consider what Jesus does. He doesn't just snarl at death here, though. He also weeps with those who weep. That's the second thing you see him doing. In John 11:35, it's the first verse I ever memorized from a Bible because it's the shortest one in the book. Jesus wept. Though the shortest verse in the Bible, it is also one of the most profound. It's incredibly powerful because God in the flesh is weeping. The flesh that concealed the glory and power of Almighty God inside of it is now trembling and stained with sorrow's tears. And he's not weeping for himself over his loss of his friend because he's just told the crowd, I will raise him from the dead. He's not even sorrowful for Lazarus, who had to suffer and face death, or even sorrowing because Lazarus will be removed from the glories of eternity back into a temporal broken home of a body. No, he's sorrowing because those that he loved were overwhelmed by grief and hurt and loss, and it broke his heart to stand there with them. He's weeping because of what sin had done to man. He knew that man was created to be in perfect fellowship with God, but sin brought death and separation between God and man, and it brought destruction to every life. The Prince of Preachers, Charles Spurgeon, he said, a Jesus who never wept could never wipe away my tears. I once heard someone say that in weeping, Jesus dignified the tears of others in the Bible who wept. People like Abraham and Jacob, David and Jonathan, Joshua and Jeremiah, Hezekiah even. But please hear me, Jesus doesn't just dignify their tears in weeping. He gives permission for your tears too. It's not unspiritual or a lack of faith to feel sorrow over life's hardships and to express them freely around others, to express them freely even to God. Clearly, Stoicism is not the philosophy that Jesus lived by or adhered to or expects you to. And I would argue that you should follow your rabbi and be willing to express emotion. But hear me, please, what Jesus is looking to develop in us is a faith that is willing to take his hand and step forward in trust as we sorrow. My friends, in the end, I'm not just comforted that Jesus cares. I can suffer and mourn with hope because Jesus came. As Spurgeon reflected on his own agony and suffering, he said, the sympathy of Jesus is the next most precious thing to Jesus' sacrifice. My friends, to know that the God to whom we cry out has himself suffered as we do, to know that he too has wept, overcome by sorrow, it causes us to recognize that we are not alone in our suffering and that God is not cruel or detached from our sorrows. He's sorrowful for our sorrow. He's weeping with us at the sorrow that's felt by us when the sting of death is experienced in us. And because he loves us, he too is in agony, and he too is angry in these moments. Not with us, even as he was not angry with them. He's angry at what sin has caused. That's why he's furious. That's why he approaches the grave with authority and anger rather than with trepidation and timidity. He steps forward demanding that the grave give up its trophy, that it give back humanity. There's author Timothy Keller who said it this way, that the weeping of Jesus tells us who Jesus is, but the rage of Jesus here tells us what Jesus came to do. Oh, when confronted with death in the grave, he snarled at it. Then he wept with those who were brokenhearted by it. But then Jesus proved himself to be victorious in confronting it. John 11, look at verse 41 again, if you'd please. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was laying. Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. What a weird funeral service. Like, if you're familiar with the Bible and you've heard this many times before, it kind of loses its jarring nature. But when's the last time you were at a graveside memorial service when maybe the preacher gets up and rather than just giving his normal spiel, he stands there in front of all of you and then turns and looks at a casket and says, I demand that you rise up. And what would happen if you just heard, I'd probably run, honestly. In this moment, death finally met its foe. Humanity had never presented a single individual who had a fair fight with death in the grave. Jesus will prove to be more than a fair foe, though. He will prove himself to be greater than death and the grave. Humanity has long answered the grave's irrevocable call until Jesus made his demand with a power and authority that death could no longer ignore. Oh, does God care about our suffering, we wonder, as we look around our sin-splintered, broken world? And how do we know that he cares about my suffering? The answer is that he got involved in our suffering. He put himself into and under and through our suffering in order to one day rescue all of us from it. Everyone in the world is asking, if there's a God, why does God allow evil and suffering? And every religion answers back, we don't really know for certain. Even Christianity, even for me as a pastor, I answer back and say, in every situation, I don't have a specific answer. I don't know for certain. But only one, Christianity, answers with an added detail that we do know this with certainty. We know that God isn't happy about suffering. Because we have Jesus coming here to earth and we have his miracles as proof that he wants to alleviate and end the suffering humanity is subjected to. Because each one of his miracles are to lift the suffering off of humanity. You see, in our story, by waiting, it gave Jesus the opportunity to reveal that he alone is humanity's ultimate answer for death and the grave, and that he provides an eternal solution for death and the grave. This was undoubtedly a great miracle, but it was ultimately only a preview of the even greater miracle yet to come at the end of John's gospel, when Jesus himself would rise from the grave, proving his true identity and the reality of his authority over life and over death. You see, much like when Jesus looked at a paralyzed man early in the gospel accounts and said, your sins are forgiven, and everyone said, you don't have the power or authority to forgive his sins, and then Jesus said, to prove to you that I do, I'll say to this man, rise up and walk. And when he did rise up and walk miraculously, it proved Jesus' power and authority to forgive sin. And here Jesus claims, I am the resurrection and life. And then he proves that he has the authority and power over life and over death when he raises Lazarus from the dead. And when he himself will later emerge from his own grave. Jesus would stand and say, I am the resurrection and the life. We've discussed why he delayed and what he does, but we conclude by just noticing what Jesus says he continues to do. You see, Jesus could not prove that he is the resurrection of life. Think about this. If Jesus could prove that he is the resurrection of life by, yes, raising Lazarus, but more importantly, by conquering death in the grave personally, when he emerged from the grave alive again, then we have an hope for the afterlife. Then we have security as we face the grave. Oh, if Jesus couldn't prove it, then we would be left without a hope. If Jesus' claims were empty and his own grave would remain occupied by his own decomposing body, then there's no God revealed to us, and there's no hope for justice in life, and there's no certainty of eternity after our death. Think this through. If there's no God, then there's no purpose. You and I are just the latest cluster of decomposing matter atop the compost pile called human existence. But there Jesus stands. He does not claim only to hold the power of resurrection and life. He claims that he is the power of resurrection and life, which he proves not just when he raises his friend Lazarus back to life, but when he himself would emerge from the grave. You see, Jesus' comment here, he doesn't ignore death. He does, however, make it perfectly clear that death no longer has the last word over humanity. Listen again to the words that Jesus said to his friend Martha. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? He asked. Did you hear that? Jesus promises resurrection and eternal life to those who believe. Faith, that was and is what Jesus is looking for. And faith could not merely be believing that Jesus existed, because the woman stood before him looking at him with her own eyes. Faith, true faith, saving faith is not just believing that he was there. It's not even believing that the stories are real, because Martha's standing there in the middle of the story. She's a part of the story, a central figure in it. No, faith, the kind of faith and belief that Jesus is asking for, is different than that. It's bigger than that. He's asking, would you trust him today? Will you choose to place your hope in Jesus today? And maybe you're thinking, well, even if I was, he couldn't want me. God can't want anything to do with the mess that I've made of my life. I'm beyond all hope, a lost cause, as good as dead and gone. If that's how you feel, then you, my friend, you need the one who says he is the resurrection and the life, and who gives life to things that are beyond all hope, who gives life to things that are already dead and buried. You see, what Jesus is saying here is not merely relevant in the hour of our death. Because he is the resurrection and life, what Jesus is offering and promising is more than hope for tomorrow. He's promising hope and life change today. It's about breathing life into a dead and broken marriage. It's about resurrection and restoration in a home that's been divided, or a dream that you've already buried, or a womb that's remained closed, or a human heart that's as stiff and rigid as a decomposing corpse. It's about new life and a fresh start being available to you and to me today. That's what Jesus is offering. Why don't you close your Bible? One of the cultural things you pick up clues of in the text here is the presence of professional mourners. When in verse 19 it talks about Jesus and the community around finding Mary and Martha there with this group of women who had gathered. In antiquity, you'd hire professional mourners because it was a way to get the word out to the local community that someone had died. It's obvious that there was no Facebook group or group chat. There's no email blast that could be sent or internet news feed or a thing that you could find the information that so-and-so has passed this week. So the more uproar and ruckus that could be caused in the city, the more it would become plain and clear to people that tragedy had struck, and then they would be motivated to go and investigate whose home was filled with sorrow in the local community. What may have began with just a local household and then maybe a team of professional mourners joining them would quickly grow into something else as the surrounding community became aware of the loss of life, and they join in with the public display of heartache and heartbreaking loss. And your level of engagement created an external gauge and measurement for the amount that you love the person who passed. In other words, the more you mourned and grieved, and the more your mourning and grief was observable to other people around you, the more clear it became to them that you really loved that person who died. Because you're not just sitting reserved in the corner. No, because they see you face down, flat out, weeping like a child. Now think, if that's all true, and that's a part of this cultural scene and setting, think of the statement, the comment they made about Jesus, where they said in verse 36, after the verse right before it says that Jesus wept, it then makes the comment that they observed saying, "See how deeply Jesus loved him." They observed the grief and sorrow in Jesus. They saw his visceral response, that he had anger at the scene and then crushing sorrow. They heard him wail and saw his tears, and based in their minds, based on the measure of his engagement with that mourning and grieving, they looked and saw, they believed, the size of his love for Lazarus. And they said, "Look how much he loved him. See how deeply he loved this man." If this is true, that they could measure the love of a person based on the amount of tears that were shed for them, then how would you measure the kind of love that somebody has for you when they'd shed not just tears, but their own blood for you? If they could be so confident in Jesus' love for Lazarus because he publicly wept like this, then what shall we say of our confidence in Jesus' love for us if he purposefully, publicly shed his blood for us and would allow his body to temporarily be laid inside of a tomb for us? It was Jesus who said, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." Jesus stood on that day and said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? So Jesus, we look your direction to answer that question. To answer your question that echoes some 2,000 years to be heard over us today. Do you believe this? And it's a question that we must answer, not just a first time, as we put our faith and hope and trust in you to save and rescue us. But it's an answer we still have to answer, or a question we still have to answer even today, for those of us who carry deep sorrow. For those of us who are quick to voice, as Martha was, that if you had only done something, I wouldn't be hurting like this. But who also have an opportunity to add to that. But I still believe that all things are possible for you. Jesus, I still trust. I still trust in who you are, God among us. I still trust in who you've proven yourself to be, a loving God who cares for me. Do you believe this? Jesus, we each as individuals, not just as a church collectively, but individuals have to answer that question today. And I thank you that you gave us reason to answer it with trust and faith and hope. That you conquered a grave emerging from your own alive, proving your identity and proving the depth of your love as demonstrated by not just the tears that you'd shed, but your blood that you'd shed for us. So Jesus, we respond today to thank you with thanksgiving. And God, I pray for anyone who's here who's never responded to this question saying, yes, Jesus, I'll trust you, I ask that you by your Spirit would speak to them beneath the surface in the quietness of their own mind and heart. And that you would appeal to them, that they'd hear this question echo so personally to them. Do you believe? And Jesus, I pray that they would respond right now, simply expressing faith, saying, yes, Jesus, I believe and I ask you, Jesus, to forgive me and to rescue me. In Jesus' name.